Hello, and welcome to the Quantum Fit Podcast. I'm Taylor, and I am your host. This podcast is all about applying principles of quantum physics and quantum biology to your health and fitness. This gives us a holistic view of how different environmental factors play a huge role in your overall health, not just diet, exercise, and good habits. If you want to really make lasting changes in how you feel, think, and act, then I suggest you listen closely and try to have an open mind to what I have to say. Normally, every day, I just put out one 7 to 15 minute long podcast to keep it informative and to the point. But today, I am giving you two. And also, before I get into this podcast, I don't do any kind of advertising right now. So instead, I ask that you share this message with a friend or family member if you enjoyed it and gained something from it. I want to be able to spread quality and easy to understand content that everyone can take and use in their own daily lives. I would highly appreciate it. Now, today's episode, Crystalline Origin Story. So I keep bringing up the book, The Body Electric, by Robert O. Becker, since, well, there's so much content in it. I mean, it's truly a Bible as far as how electromagnetism affects the body, affects living systems. And, I guess there's one portion of the book that I really wanted to dive into. It's basically a theory as to how living things were first created, so it's an origin story, essentially. So I'll skip some of the first section and just kind of summarize. It's basically saying that, the most commonly accepted theory, which is basically there was sort of a warm soup on Earth of just organic compounds and lightning just struck it and, eventually DNA and RNA were created and, everything after came from that. But this other theory sees that as insufficient. It doesn't take into account living systems being able to take in outside information and grow from them and be able to deal with the environment. It just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. So for the rest of this podcast, I am simply just going to be reading again from The Body Electric. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I sure did. So, we must conceive of the first living things as something unexpected, not just simpler versions of what we see around us. They couldn't have been cells. They couldn't have had a DNA, RNA, protein system, a living membrane, or a nerve impulse network. We can try to define the bare minimum, the processes that must be available before an entity can be called living. There must be a way to receive information about external conditions, process it, and store it so that the data change the being's response to the same stimulus in the future. In other words, a sort of crude consciousness and memory must be present from the first. A life form must also be able to sense damage and repair itself. Third, we can expect that it would show some sort of cyclic activity, perhaps tuned primarily to the circadian rhythm of the lunar day. Self-replication, one of the main requirements in the DNA-based theory, can be dispensed with. An organism that can fully heal its injuries is theoretically immortal. The criteria for life can be summarized as organization, information processing, regeneration, and rhythm. The funny thing is that all of these criteria are met by the activities of semiconducting crystals. Semiconductivity occurs naturally in several inorganic crystals, including silicon, one of the most common elements, and the rare earth germanium. Moreover, extremely small amounts of contaminants, will change the crystal's electrical properties dramatically in doping. The Earth's volcanic mixing would have produced minerals with a wide variety of current handling abilities to start from. Most important, the piezoelectric, pyroelectric, photoelectric, and other responses of semiconducting crystals could have served as an analog method of processing and storing information about pressure, heat, and light. Moreover, repeated passage of current through some semiconductors permanently changes the material's characteristics so as to make the same electrical responses easier in the future. Movement of electrons along the crystal lattices inevitably would have been shaped by geocelestial cycles in the Earth's electromagnetic field, as well as by the fields around other crystalline organisms nearby, providing a sense of time and information about the neighbors. The currents also would have instantly reflected any loss of material and guided the deposition of replacement atoms to restore the original structure. The idea of certain rocks, in the course of 1 billion years or so, gradually becoming responsive to their surroundings, growing, learning to quote-unquote hurt when a lava flow or sulfuric rain ate away part of a vortex, slowly rebuilding, pulsing with, life, even developing to a liquid crystal stage and climbing free of their stony nests like Cadmus's dragon's teeth or the lizards in an MC Escher print. All this may seem a bit bizarre, yet it's really no more strange than imagining the same information from droplets of broth. The change happened somehow. The biggest hurdle for this theory is accepting the idea that life could develop in the dry state, either out of the oceans or in the rocks underneath them. Since the mid-1960s, it has seemed more plausible, for it was then that H.E. Hinton of the University of Bristol, England, learned that at least one organism spends part of its life completely without liquid water. Certain flies of the Sahara Desert lay their eggs in the brief pools formed by the rare rains. The larvae go through several metamorphoses in the water, but they're almost always interrupted by the evaporation of the pool. Though completely desiccated, in a state Hinton named cryptobiosis, they survive months or years until the next rainstorm, whereupon they take up where they left off. The larvae can be quick-dried and stored in a vacuum bottle for many years. Placed in water, they resurrect in a few minutes. If a larva is cut in two when active, it takes 6 minutes to die. If it's flash-dried in the first minute, the two pieces can be kept on a shelf for years, but when returned to water, they'll live out the remaining 5 minutes. Contrary to common sense, it appears that in this case, life doesn't need water, but death can't occur without it. Getting rid of the water equals life assumption makes the crystalline theory more believable. Conditions on the young planet favored forests of crystals. It was hot. Volcanoes were constantly firing new materials into the dense, dark shell of turbulent gases. However, the crystals would still have needed outside energy to overcome the entropy of non-living matter. With an organizing principle built into them from the start, it's not too hard to imagine them acquiring other kinds of molecules, including the organics raining from the sky and dissolving in the waters. Then life would have been on its way to developing the biochemistry we now know, the genetic system, and the consequent appearance of sexuality, which is the basis of all the creatures now alive or known from the fossil record. Still, we need an energy source for the transition. Lightning won't work in this context. We also need an explanation for the exclusively left or right-handed molecules. In 1974, F. E. Cole and E. R. Graff of New Orleans made a theoretical analysis of the pre-Cambrian Earth's electromagnetic field that fulfilled both of those different needs. They reasoned that since the atmosphere was much larger then, it must have pushed the ionosphere much further out than it is today into the region of the Van Allen belts. The Earth would then have had an electromagnetic resonator of two concentric spheres, the upper atmosphere and the surface. Today, as in the past, the Earth's pulsing magnetic field combines with the solar wind to induce large currents in the Van Allen belts. In the Precambrian era, however, the fluctuations of current in the Van Allen belts in turn would have generated huge currents in the nearby ionosphere. Since the Earth's metallic core is an excellent conductor, the ionospheric currents would have coupled to it, producing an enormous and constant electrical discharge through the atmosphere and into the Earth. Moreover, since the distance around the core at that time was roughly equal to one wavelength of electromagnetic energy at 10 cycles per second, or about 18,000 miles. This discharge would have pulsed at 10 hertz throughout the resonant cavity, which encompassed the whole atmosphere and surface. Besides directly providing electrical energy, this discharge would have produced abundant heat, ultraviolet radiation, and infrasound, or pressure waves, all of which would have fostered varied chemical activity. Such a dense and electrically supercharged atmosphere undoubtedly would have produced great quantities of amino acids and peptides. As they came together in the air and water, linking chain-wise to form proteins and nucleic acids, the vectors of electromagnetic force would have favored spiral shapes, twisting in one direction or the other, depending on whether the reaction occurred in the northern or the southern hemisphere. In 1981, W. Thierman and U. Jarzak found some direct evidence for this theory by synthesizing organic compounds in a steady-state magnetic field. Changing the orientation of the field gave them high yields of either D or L forms, which, this is an aside from me. Basically, a chemical can have one kind of shape, but then if you were to make a mirror of it, you would get the same chemical, but it would be the mirror. It would function very different in living systems. Think of it like you have your right hand and you have your left hand. They're the mirrors of each other. Think of that, except the chemical structure. Continuing on. It may be possible to run a further check on the Crystalline graph hypothesis at one place in the solar system, the Great Red Spot of Jupiter. This permanent hurricane, whose eye could swallow the Earth, continually emits prodigious electrical discharges through an atmosphere much like the one proposed for Precambrian times. It may be synthesizing organic compounds and energizing a transition to life even now. On Earth, all entities formed within the 10 Hz discharge, and all of their descendants, would resonate at the same frequency or show extreme sensitivity to it, even after the original power source had been disconnected. The 10 Hz band would remain supremely important for most life forms, as indeed it has. As already noted, it's the primary frequency of the EEG in all animals, and it can be used to restore normal circadian rhythms to humans cut off from the normal fields of Earth, Moon, and Sun. William Ross Addy of the Loma Linda, Virginia Hospital, VA Hospital, in California, has found that magnetic fields modulated at about the same frequency can be that the magnetic fields modulated at about the same frequency of 10 Hz can be used to change the behavior of monkeys in several important ways. The Crystalline graph theory also suggests how the spark of life turned itself off. The currents driving the discharges would have ceased as the atmosphere gradually became depleted by escape of the lighter gases and by incorporation of the ammonia and methane into organic compounds. As this happened, the ionosphere would have gradually descended, becoming disconnected from the Van Allen belts. The ionospheric currents would have become too small to couple to the Earth's core, and the atmospheric cavity too small to resonate at the core's prescribed frequency. At that point, the plug was pulled, but life was well on its way. Aside from competition from more advanced creatures, the loss of the energy source would explain why we see today no remnants of the transitional forms still emerging from inanimate matter. In other words, the life forms that were between the stages of basically minerals and cells of bacteria like we have today, the life forms in between those two. The solid-state theory of life's creation is more than an exciting picture of our birth in a shower of sparks. It leads us to another of biology's great mysteries, the evolution of nervous systems, by a sensible sequence of steps. First, there would have been a crystalline protocell transmitting information directly through its molecular lattice. As the first cells developed, we can envision chains of microcrystals, then chains of organic polymers transmitting information in the form of semiconducting currents. Although the exact mechanism of electron passage through living tissue is far from clear, nearly all organic matter exhibits piezoelectricity and all the other hallmarks of semiconduction. Furthermore, in a series of experiments during the 1970s, Freeman Cope, a Navy biophysicist building on Szent-György's work, has found evidence of superconduction at room temperature in a variety of living matter. Currents briefly induced in superconductors have been known to flow for many years without decay, but the phenomenon has heretofore been attained only near absolute zero. Although Cope's work is still preliminary and uncorroborated, he has found electromagnetic data consistent with superconduction in E. coli, bacteria, frog and crayfish nerves, yeast, sea urchin eggs, and molecules of RNA, melanin pigment, and the enzyme lysosome. Whatever the exact details of the conducting system, the first multicellular organisms probably had networks of cells that were much like the first single cells. Later, these network cells would have specialized for their DC carrying duties, linking into syncytia to avoid the high resistance of intercellular junctions. Somewhere along the line, a central processing center and information storehouse would have developed. At the same time, separate input and output tracks would have appeared, and the DC system would have neared its peak of specialization as its cells evolved into the prototypes of glial, ependymal, and Schwann cells. At about this point, the high-speed digital impulse system for handling more complex information would have begun to form inside the older one. Today, all multicellular animals have this kind of hybrid system, whose complexities should provide work for at least a few more generations of neurophysiologists. Okay, that was definitely over 15 minutes. We're at just about 17 minutes now. But I thought that would be an important passage to read through, even though it has a lot of complicated and long terms. It gives us a good foundation to look at in the coming podcasts, looking at life having developed as semi-liquid crystals. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. Again, I'm going to be hitting you with a second one shortly here. If you have any questions or comments about this specific podcast, you can reach out to me on Instagram at RealQuantumFit, on my personal Facebook page, Taylor Kelson, or send a voice message across the Anchor app. You'll hear from me in a bit.